Hello everybody, it is time for To Kill a Mockingbird once again. When we last left, we had talked about, or we read about, what was happening in the small town of Maycomb. We know about Scout, we know about Jem, we know about their father Atticus, and that he's a lawyer and he's lived in the area forever. There we met Miss Maudie, who has known Atticus forever, and her house had burned down, and she's living with Miss Stephanie Crawford, who is a bit of a gossip. We've met Dill, who comes in the summer to stay with his Aunt Rachel. We've met Cecil Jacobs, who goes to school with Scout, and though they're friends, he started to make fun of her and tease her because for what her dad was doing and what he was working on. And what he's working on is, as a lawyer, he is defending a black man. We don't know anything about that case, but we do know that there have been different issues. Scout got into a fight with her cousin because he was making fun of her, and they had trouble with Mrs. Du Bois, who lived just down the block. And she was always rude and mean, but she was especially so as Atticus took on this case. So, all of these different kinds of things are happening. Oh my gosh, and I forgot all about the Radleys. Boo Radley, who is locked away in his house. Why is he locked away? We don't know. We know a lot of rumors, but we don't exactly know for sure. We know the kids are scared of him. We know they're scared to go by his house, and they take the long way around. But we do know that, especially when Dill was there, in the summers, they wanted to make contact and try to. And it looks like there have been several times that Boo Radley made contact with them. He put things in the knothole in the tree. He put the blanket around Scout when Miss Maudie's house was on fire and they were all standing outside. And I think that we're to assume that he sewed up Jem's pants when he was trying to escape under the fence and ripped his pants and had to take them off in order to get out. So we have to wonder, what type of person is this Boo Radley, and will they ever meet him? We're starting where it says part 2 in the book, and just so you know, we're this far in. This has to be read still. But this is all really part of the exposition and the rising action. And the conflict is really going to be starting to happen now as we really get into the thick of it and find out exactly what is happening with Tom Robinson and what we have to be aware of. And so we are going to be starting chapter 12, page 153. Jem was 12. He was difficult to live with. Inconsistent, moody. His appetite was appalling, and he told me so many times to stop pestering him, I consulted Atticus. Reckon he's got a tapeworm? Atticus said no. Jem was growing. I must be patient with him and disturb him as little as possible. Well, this change in Jem had come out in a matter of weeks. Mrs. Du Bois was not cold in her grave. Jem had seemed grateful enough for my company when he went to read her. Overnight, it seemed, Jem had acquired an alien set of values and was trying to impose them on me. Several times he went so far as to tell me what to do. But after one evening, in one altercation, when Jem hollered, "It's time you started being a girl and acting right," I burst into tears and fled to Calpurnia. "Oh, don't you fret too much over Mr. Jem," she began. "Mr. Jem?" "Yeah. He's just about Mr. Jem now." "He ain't that old," I said. "All he needs is somebody to beat him up, and I ain't big enough." "Well, baby," said Calpurnia, "I just can't help it if Mr. Jem growing up. He's gonna want to be off to himself a lot now, doing whatever boys do, so you just come right on in the kitchen when you feel lonesome, and we'll find lots of things to do in here." The beginning of that summer boded well. Jem would do as he pleased. Calpurnia would do until Dill came. She seemed glad to see me when I appeared in the kitchen, and by watching her, I began to think there was some skill involved in being a girl. But summer came, and Dill was not there. I received a letter and a snapshot from him. The letter said that he had a new father whose picture was enclosed, and he would have to stay in Meridian because they planned to build a fishing boat. His father was a lawyer like Atticus, only much younger. Dill's new father had a pleasant face, which made me glad Dill had captured him, but I was crushed. Dill concluded by saying that he would love me forever and not to worry. He would come get me and marry me as soon as he got enough money together. So please write. The fact that I had a permanent fiancé was of little compensation for his absence. I'd never thought about it, but summer was Dill by the fishing pool, smoking string, and Dill's eyes alive with complicated plans to make Boo Bradley emerge. Summer was the swiftness with which Dill could reach up and kiss me, and when Jem was not looking, the longings we sometimes felt for each other. With him, love was routine. Without him, love was unbearable. I stayed miserable for 2 days. As if that were not enough, the state legislature was called into emergency session and Atticus left us for 2 weeks. The governor was eager to scrape a few barnacles off the ship of state. There were sit-down strikes in Birmingham. Bread lines in the cities grew longer, people in the country grew poorer, and these were events remote from the world of Jem and me. We were surprised one morning to see a cartoon in Montgomery Advertiser above the caption, Maycomb's Finch. It showed Atticus barefooted and in short pants, chained to a desk. He was diligently writing on a slate while some frivolous-looking girls yelled, "Yoo-hoo!" at him. "Well, that's a compliment," said Jem. "He spends his time doing things that wouldn't get done if nobody did 'em." Huh? In addition to Jem's newly developed characteristics, he had acquired a maddening air of wisdom. "Oh, Scout, it's like reorganizing the tax system of the counties and things. That kind of thing's pretty dry to most men." "Well, how do you know?" "Oh, go on and leave me alone. I'm reading the paper." Jem got his wish. I departed for the kitchen. And while she was shelling peas, Calpurnia suddenly said, "What am I going to do about you all's church this Sunday?" "Nothing, I reckon. Atticus left us collection." Calpurnia's eyes narrowed, and I could tell what was going through her mind. "Cal," I said, "you know we'll behave. We haven't done anything in church for years." Calpurnia evidently remembered a rainy Sunday when we were both fatherless and teacherless. Left to our own devices, the class tied Eunice Ann Simpson to a chair and placed her in the furnace. We forgot her, trooped upstairs to church, and were listening quietly to the sermon when a dreadful banging issued from the radiator pipes, persisted until someone investigated and brought forth Eunice Ann, saying she didn't want to play sand track any more. Jem Finch said she wouldn't get burnt if she had enough faith, but it was hot down there. "Besides, Cal, this isn't the first time Atticus has left us," I protested. "Yeah, but he makes certain your teacher's going to be there. I didn't hear him say that this time. Reckon he forgot it." Calpurnia scratched her head, and suddenly she smiled. "Well, how'd you, Mr. Jem, like to come to church with me tomorrow?" "Really?" "How about it?" grinned Calpurnia. If Calpurnia had ever bathed me roughly before, it was nothing compared to her supervision of that Saturday night's routine. She made me soap all over twice, threw fresh water in the tub for each rinse. She stuck my head in the basin and washed it with octagon soap and castile. She had trusted Jem for years, but that night she invaded his privacy and provoked an outburst. "Can't anybody take a bath in this house without the whole family looking?" Next morning, she began earlier than usual to go over our clothes, and when Calpurnia stayed overnight with us, she slept on a folding cot in the kitchen. That morning it was covered with our Sunday's habiliments. She had put so much starch in my dress it came up like a tent when I sat down. And she made me wear a petticoat. She wrapped a pink sash tightly around my waist. She went over my patent leather shoes with a cold biscuit until she saw her face in them. "It's like we were going to Mardi Gras," said Jem. "What's all this for, Cal?" "Well, I don't want anybody saying I don't look after my children," she muttered. "Mr. Jem, you absolutely can't wear that tie with that suit. It's green." "What's the matter with that?" "Well, the suit's blue. Can't you tell?" "He, he, he." I howled. Jim's colorblind. His face flushed angry, but Calpurnia said, now you all quit that. You're going to go to First Purchase with smiles on your faces. First Purchase African M.E. Church was in the quarters outside of the southern town limits, across the old sawmill tracks. It was an ancient paint-peeled frame building, the only church in Maycomb with a steeple and bell called First Purchase because it was paid for from the first earnings of freed slaves. Negro worshipped in that on Sundays, and white men gambled in it on weekdays. The churchyard was brick-hard clay, as was the cemetery beside it. If someone died during a dry spell, the body was covered with chunks of ice until rain softened the earth. A few graves in the cemetery were marked with crumbling tombstones, and newer ones were outlined with brightly colored glass and broken Coca-Cola bottles. Latin around guarded some graves, I can't say that word, for the dead who rested uneasily. Stumps of burned-out candles stood at the heads of infant graves. It was a happy cemetery. The warm, bittersweet smell of clean Negro welcomed us as we entered the churchyard. Hearts of love, hairdressing mingled with estifrate, snuff, Hoyt's cologne, Brown's mule, peppermint, and lilac talcum. When they saw Jem and me with Calpurnia, the men stepped back, and they took off their hats, and the women crossed their arms at their waists, weekday gestures of respectful attention. They parted, and they made a small path to the church door for us. Calpurnia walked between Jem and me, responding to the greetings of her brightly clad neighbors. "What you up to, Miss Cal?" said a voice behind us. Calpurnia's hands went to our shoulders, and we stopped and looked around. Standing in the path behind us was a tall Negro woman. Her weight was on one leg. She rested her left elbow in the curve of her hip, pointed at us with upturned palm. She was bullet-headed with strange almond-shaped eyes, straight nose, and Indian bow mouth. She seemed 7 feet high. I felt Calpurnia's hand digging my shoulder. "Well, what you want, Lula?" she asked in tones that I had never heard her use. She spoke quietly and contemptuously. "I wants to know why you're bringing white children to this church." "Well, there's my company," said Calpurnia. Again I thought her voice strange. She was talking like the rest of them. "Yeah, and I reckon y'all's company at the Fish House during the week." A murmur ran through the crowd. "Don't fret," Calpurnia whispered to me, but the roses on her hat trembled indignantly. When Lula came up the path towards us, Calpurnia said, "You stop right there." And Lula stopped, but she said, "You ain't got no business bringing white children here. They got their church, we got ours. It's our church, ain't it, Miss Cal?" Calpurnia said, "It's the same God, ain't it?" Jem said, "Let's go home, Cal. They don't want us here." I agreed. They did not want us here. I sensed rather than saw that we were being advanced upon. They seemed to be drawn closer to us. But when I looked up at Calpurnia, there was an amusement in her eyes. When I looked down the pathway again, Lula was gone. In her place was a solid mass of colored people. One of them stepped from the crowd. It was Zebo, the garbage collector. "Mr. Jim," he said, "we're mighty glad to have you all here. Don't pay no attention to Lula. She's contentious because Reverend Sachs threatened to church her. She's a troublemaker from way back. Got fancy ideas and haughty ways. We're mighty glad to have you all." With that, Calpurnia led us to the church door, where we were greeted by Reverend Sachs, who led us to the front pew. First Purchase was unsealed and unpainted within. Along its walls, unlighted kerosene lamps hung on brass brackets. Pine benches served as pews. Behind the rough oak pulpit, a faded pink silk banner proclaimed "God is love," the church's only decoration, except a print of Hunt's "The Light of the World." There was no sign of a piano or organ, hymn books, church programs, the familiar ecclesiastical impediments we saw every Sunday. It was dim inside, with a damp coolness slowly dispelled by the gathering congregation. At each seat was a cheap cardboard fan bearing a garish garden of jessamine courtesy of Tyndall's Hardware Company. You name it, we sell it. Calpurnia motioned Jem and me to the end of the row, and placed herself between us. She fished in her purse and drew out her handkerchief and untied the hard wad of change in its corner. She gave a dime to me and a dime to Jem. "Oh, we got ours," she whispered. "You keep it," Calpurnia said. "You're my company." Jem's face showed brief indecision on the ethics of withholding his own dime, but his innate courtesy won, and he shifted his dime to his pocket. I did likewise, with no qualms. "Cal," I whispered, "where are the hymn books?" "Oh, we don't have any," she said. "Well, shh," she said. Reverend Sykes was standing behind the pulpit, staring the congregation to silence. He was a short, stalky man with a black suit, black tie, white shirt, and a gold watch chain that glinted in the light from the frosted windows. He said, "Brethren and sisters, we are particularly glad to have company with us this morning. Mr. and Miss Finch, you all know their father. Before I begin, I will read some announcements." Reverend Sykes shuffled some papers, chose one, and held it at arm's length. "The Missionary Society meets in the home of Sister Annette Reeves next Tuesday. Bring your sewing." He read from another paper. "You all know of Brother Tom Robinson's trouble. He has been a faithful member of First Purchase since he was a boy. The collection taken up today and for the next 3 Sundays will go to Helen, his wife, to help her at home." I punched Jem. "That's Tom's Atticus. Shh." I turned to Calpurnia, but was hushed before I opened my mouth. Subdued, I fixed my attention upon Reverend Sykes, who seemed to be waiting for me to settle down. "Will the music superintendent lead us in the first hymn?" he said. Zebo rose from his pew and walked down the center aisle, stopping in front of us and faced the congregation. He was carrying a battered hymn book. He opened it and said, "We'll sing number 273. This was just too much for me. "How are we going to sing it if we ain't got any hymn books?" Calpurnia smiled. "Hush, baby," she whispered. "You'll see in a minute." Zebo cleared his throat and read in a voice like the rumble of a distant artillery. "There's a land beyond the river." Miraculously, on pitch, 100 voices sang out Zebo's words, and the last syllable, held to a husky hum, was followed by Zebo saying, "That we call the sweet river." And music again swelled around us, and the last note lingered, and Zebo met it with the next line, "And we only reach that shore by faith's decree." And the congregation hesitated. Zebo repeated the line carefully, and it was sung. At the chorus, Zebo closed the book, a signal for the congregation to proceed without his help. On the dying notes of Jubilee, Zebo said, "In that far-off sweet forever, just beyond the shining river." Line for line, voices followed in simple harmony until the hymn ended in a melancholy murmur. I looked at Jem, who was looking at Zebo from the corner of his eyes. I didn't believe it either, but we'd both heard it. Reverend Sykes then called on the Lord to bless the sick and the suffering, a procedure no different from our church practice, except Reverend Sykes directed the deity's attention to several specific cases. His sermon was a forthright denunciation of sin and austere declaration of the motto on the wall behind him. He warned his flock against the evils of heady brews, gambling, and strange women. Bootleggers caused enough trouble in the quarters, but women were worse. Again, as I had often met it in my own church, I was confronted with the impurity of women doctrine that seemed to preoccupy all clergy. Jem and I had heard the same sermon Sunday after Sunday, with only one exception. Reverend Sykes used his pulpit more freely to express his views on individual lapses from grace. Jim Hardy had been absent from church for 5 Sundays, and he wasn't sick. And Constance Jackson had better watch her ways. She was in grave danger of quarreling with her neighbors. She erected the only spot fence in the history of the quarters. Reverend Sykes closed his sermon. He stood beside a table in front of the pulpit and requested the morning offering, a proceeding that was strange to Jem and me. One by one, the congregation came forward and dropped nickels and dimes in a black enamel coffee can. Jem and I followed suit and received a soft, "Thank you, thank you." as our dimes clinked. To our amazement, Reverend Sachs emptied the can onto the table and raked the coins into his hand. He straightened up and he said, it's not enough. We must have $10. The congregation stirred. You all know what it's like for Helen. She can't leave those kids to work while Tom's in jail. If everybody gives one more dime, we'll have it. Reverend waved his hand and called to someone in the back of the church. Alex, shut the doors. Nobody leaves here till we have $10. Calpurnia scratched in her handbag and brought forth a battered leather coin purse. No, Cal, Jim whispered when she handed him a shiny quarter. We can put ours in. Give me your dime, Scout. The church had become stuffy, and it occurred to me that Reverend Sachs intended to sweat the amount due out of his flock. Fans cracked, feet shuffled, tobacco chewers were in agony. Reverend Sachs startled me by saying sternly, Carol L. Richardson, I have not seen you up this aisle yet. A thin man in khaki pants came up the aisle and deposited a coin, and the congregation murmured approval. Reverend Sachs then said, I want all of you with no children to make a sacrifice and give one more dime apiece, and then we'll have it. Slowly, painfully, the $10 was collected. The door was opened, and a gust of warm air revived us. The gazebo lined Old Jordan, stormy banks, and church was over. I wanted to stay and explore, but Calpurnia propelled me up the aisle ahead of her. At the church door, while she paused to talk to Zebo and his family, Jem and I chatted with Reverend Sachs. I was bursting with questions, but decided I'd wait and let Calpurnia answer them. We were especially glad to have you all here, said Reverend Sachs. This church has no better friend than your dad. My curiosity burst. Why were you all taking up a collection for Tom Robinson's wife? Well, didn't you hear why? Said Reverend Sachs. Helen's got 3 little ones. She can't go to work. Well, why can't she take 'em with her, Reverend? I asked. It was customary for field Negroes with China children to deposit them in whatever shade there was while their parents worked. Usually the babies sat in the shade between 2 rows of cotton, and those unable to sit were strapped papoose style on their moms' backs or resided in extra cotton bags. Reverend Sachs hesitated. Well, to tell the truth, Miss Jean Louise, Helen's find it hard to get work these days. When it's picking time, I think Mr. Link Dees will take her. Oh, why not, Reverend? Before he could answer, I felt Calpurnia's hand on my shoulder. At its pressure, I said, we thank you for letting us come. And Jim echoed me, and we made our way homeward. Cal, I know Tom Robinson's in jail, and he's done something awful, but why won't folks hire Helen? I asked. Calpurnia, in her navy voile dress and tub of a hat, walked between Jim and me. It's because of what folks say Tom done, she said. Folks aren't anxious to have anything to do with any of his family. Well, just what did he do, Cal? Calpurnia sighed. Oh, Mr. Bob Yule accused him of raping his girl and had him arrested and put in jail. Mr. Yule? My memory stirred. Does he have anything to do with those Yules that come every first day of school and then go home? Why, Atticus said they were absolute trash. I never heard Atticus talk about folks the way he talked about the Yules. He said, yeah, they're the ones. Well, if everybody in Maycomb knows what kind of folks the Yules are, they'd be glad to hire Helen. What's rape, Cal? It's something you'll have to ask Miss Finch about, she said. We can explain it better than I can. You all hungry? The Reverend took a long time unwinding this morning. He's not usually so tedious. Well, he's just like our preacher, said Jim. But why do you all sing hymns that way? Lining? She asked. Is that what it's called? Yeah, it's called lining. They're doing that way as long as I can remember. Jim said it looked like they had saved the collection money for a year. They could get hymn books. Calpurnia laughed. Wouldn't do any good, she said. They can't read. Can't read? I asked. All those folks? That's right, Calpurnia nodded. Can't, but about 4 folks in Purchase read. I'm one of them. Where'd you go to school, Cal? Asked Jim. Nowhere. Let's see now, who taught me my letters? It was, Miss Morty's aunt, old Miss Buford. Are you that old? Well, I'm older than Mr. Finch, even, Calpurnia grinned. Not sure how much, though. We started remembering one time, trying to figure out how old I was. I can remember back just a few more years more than he can, so I'm not much older. And when you take off the fact that men can't remember as well as women. Well, what's your birthday, Cal? I just have it on Christmas. It's easier to remember. I don't have a real birthday. But Cal, Jem protested, you don't even look near as old as Atticus. Well, colored folks don't show their ages as fast, she said. Well, maybe because they can't read. Cal, did you teach Zebo? Yeah, Mr. Jem. There wasn't a school even when he was a boy. I made him learn, though. Zebo was Calpurnia's eldest son. If I'd ever thought about it, I would have known that Calpurnia was of mature years. Zebo had half-grown children, but then I'd never thought about it. Did you teach him out of a primer like us, I asked. No, I made him get a page of the Bible every day, and there was a book Miss Buford taught me out of. Bet you wouldn't know where I got it, she said. We didn't know, and Calpurnia said, your granddaddy Finch gave it to me. Were you from the Landing? Jem asked. You never told us that. I certainly am, Mr. Jem. Grew up down there between the Buford place and the Landing. I spent all my days working for the Finches or the Bufords, and I moved to Maycomb when your daddy and your mama married. Well, what was the book, Cal? I asked. Blackstone's Commentaries. Jem was thunderstruck. You mean you taught Zebo out of that? Why, yes, sir, Mr. Jem, Calpurnia timidly put her fingers to her mouth. Oh, they were the only books I had. Your granddaddy said Blackstone wrote fine English. Well, that's why you don't talk like the rest of them, said Jem. Rest of who? Rest of the colored folks. Cal, but you talk like they did in church. That Cal led a modest double life never dawned on me. The idea that she had a separate existence outside our household was a novel one, to say nothing of her having command of 2 languages. Cal, I asked, why did you talk that talk to your folks when you know it's not right? Well, in the first place, I am black. Well, that doesn't mean you have to talk that way when you know better, said Jem. Calpurnia tilted her hat, scratched her head, and then pressed her hat down carefully over her ears. It's right hard to say, she said. Suppose you and Scout talked colored folk at home, it'd be out of place, wouldn't it? Now, what if I talk white folk talk at church with my neighbors? They'd think I was putting on airs to beat Moses. But Cal, you know better, I said. It's not necessary to tell you to tell all you know. It's not ladylike. And in the second place, folks don't like you having somebody around knowing more than they do. It aggravates them. You're not going to change any of them by talking right. They've got to want to learn themselves. And when they don't want to learn, there is nothing that you can do but keep your mouth shut or talk their language. Cal, can I come see you sometime? She looked down at me. See me, honey? You see me every day. No, out of the house, I said. Sometimes after work. Atticus can get me. Any time you want to, she said. We'd be glad to have you. We were on the sidewalk by the Radley place. Look on the porch yonder, Jem said. I looked over to the Radley place, expecting to see its phantom occupant sunning himself in the swing, but the swing was empty. I mean our porch, said Jem. I looked down the street, enamored, upright, uncompromising. Aunt Alexandra was sitting in a rocking chair exactly as if she had been there every day of her life. And that is the end of chapter 12. So I think that we learn a lot about Calpurnia, but also about Scout and Jem. Obviously, they have been around black people, and there are a variety of different terms in this chapter alone to be used. Cal calls herself black. They talk about Negro. They use that other word that I can't use because I got my mouth washed out with soap. And they have different ideas. The way that the other black people talk is different and doesn't sound as educated or intellectual. And they ask Cal, why, when you're at church, do you talk like that? Why don't you know better, they say. And I don't think that that's necessarily meant as mean or that Scout and Jem are prejudiced. I think that they just were taught that there are ways to speak and ways to not speak. We've kind of heard Atticus talking with them about that. And it doesn't have to do with race. It has to do with being kind and being intelligent and being courageous and doing what's right and saying what's right and keeping all of that kind of a thing in mind. But they're not prejudiced. Scout does not have a problem, neither does Jem, of going to this church, of being there, of being around the people who are black. You can imagine Mrs. Du Bois would have huge problems with it. They didn't. In fact, Scout wants to go to Cal's house to be there. She just doesn't consider. You'll keep in mind this whole book is coming from her point of view. Zebo was one who came out to get the dog. And when she talked about him and the truck pulling up and him coming out and all that, she didn't say one word about the color of his skin or making a judgment about that. And even with the church and how it was different, it wasn't judged different just because of the race of the people who were in it. It was just something that was different. And we found out what Tom Robinson is in jail for. And you know the rules. You remember that horrible Yule boy, Beers Yule, and that he had cooties in his hair, and the teacher sent him home, and as he was leaving, he told the teacher, "You're not kicking me out." And he called her an SLUT. So that's what this family is. And they talked about how Dad doesn't work and he gets welfare, and when he gets the money, he spends it on booze. And he hunts out of season because he spends all of his money on booze. So that's what that family is. But they're white. We're going to start to see that prejudice all play a part. And who should show up on their porch but Aunt Alexandra, who we know does not agree with how her brother Atticus is raising these kids and letting them run wild and all of that different kind of stuff. So we're going to find out why she's there and what exactly is going on. And that is going to happen in chapter 13, which will be the next one that we listen to.